Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into the hushed corners of history, venturing into a past shrouded in shadows and ancient anxieties. Imagine for a moment a world where your very worth, your place in society, your family's honor could hinge on something as deeply private as your physical purity. You find yourself standing in a drafty, dimly lit room, maybe the back corner of a tavern after hours, or perhaps a small, cramped chamber in someone's home, the air thick with unspoken tension. The faint flicker of a single candle casts dancing, uncertain shadows on the rough-hewn walls. You can almost smell the stale wine, the musty scent of old bread, the faint, lingering odor of fear. In this world, proof wasn't just about sworn oaths or witnesses. Sometimes it was about something far stranger, something involving mundane objects elevated to the status of divine instruments. Tonight, we're going to explore how, in certain times and places, people genuinely believed you could test something as intangible as virginity using nothing more than bread, wine, and the revealing glow of candlelight. Yes, you heard that right. Bread, wine, why, candlelight. It sounds utterly bizarre, like a medieval party game gone horribly wrong. And honestly, surviving this journey with your modern sensibilities intact might be the biggest challenge you face tonight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you, the comments section is always a cozy spot for that. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle in, let the concept of this ancient world wash over you. Picture it, a place where the lines between the physical, the spiritual, and the social were incredibly blurry. A place where personal status was often tied directly to perceived moral standing, and where morality, especially for women, was inextricably linked to sexual conduct. It feels so alien from our perspective today, where personal privacy is often championed, though maybe not always respected in the age of social media, right? Back then, the idea of virginity, or more broadly, sexual purity before marriage, wasn't just a personal choice or a religious ideal. It was a significant social and economic concern. You see, in many historical societies, particularly those with patriarchal structures and systems of inherited wealth or status, ensuring the legitimacy of heirs was paramount. How could a man be sure that the child his wife bore was truly his, and therefore the rightful inheritor of his land, his title, his possessions? One perceived safeguard, however flawed and unfair, was to ensure the woman was a virgin upon marriage. This created immense pressure, a weight pressing down on young women from the moment they were considered marriageable. It wasn't just about virtue, it was about property lines and power structures. The anxiety around this wasn't subtle. It permeated laws, customs, religious doctrines, and folklore. Think about dowries, the wealth a bride brought to a marriage. In many cultures, the value of a dowry could be influenced by a woman's perceived purity. A woman whose virginity was questioned, or worse, definitively lost before marriage, could find her marriage prospects diminished, her family shamed, and her future precarious. It wasn't a small matter, it was life-altering. This wasn't limited to one region or era either. You see echoes of this concern in ancient Mesopotamian laws, in classical Greek and Roman attitudes towards women, throughout the medieval period in Europe, and in countless cultures around the world. It's a mainstream historical fact that across diverse societies, controlling female sexuality, often through the enforcement of premarital chastity, was a common mechanism for maintaining social order and economic stability within patriarchal systems. It's a heavy thought, isn't it? This deep-seated fear and control woven into the fabric of daily life. And because this anxiety was so pervasive, so crucial to the functioning of society as they knew it, people weren't content to just rely on trust or expectation. They sought proof. But how do you prove something invisible? Something that happened or didn't happen in private? This is where things start to get truly fascinating and, frankly, a little strange. Lacking modern medical knowledge or forensic techniques, and let's be honest, even with them, proving past virginity is complex and often reliant on assumptions, historical societies turn to other methods. They looked for physical signs, yes, often relying on deeply flawed and harmful beliefs about the female body that had little basis in reality. Remember how, not that long ago in history, people genuinely believed in things like spontaneous generation or that bad smells cause disease. Their understanding of the body was often just as, if not more, imaginative. Beyond looking for dubious physical signs, they also appealed to higher powers. If humans couldn't verify the truth, surely the divine could. This led to the development of various forms of ordeals, trials or tests that were believed to reveal guilt or innocence through divine intervention. You might be familiar with some of the more dramatic ones, like trial by combat or trial by hot iron, where the outcome of a physical struggle or the healing or lack thereof of a burn was taken as God's judgment. These were often public dramatic events. But the tests we're going to focus on tonight, the ones involving bread, wine, and candlelight, were different. They were often more private, more subtle, and specifically tied to revealing inner truths, not just proving guilt in a criminal case. They were, in a sense, ancient lie detectors, but with a spiritual twist, aimed at revealing the truth of a person's perceived sexual purity. Think about the mindset needed to believe in such tests. You have to accept that the divine is not only watching, but is willing to intervene in mundane human affairs, using everyday objects as tools. You have to believe that a sacred substance, when consumed by an impure or deceitful person, would cause a specific, observable physical reaction as a sign of divine displeasure. It's a world steeped in superstition, certainly, but also in a genuine, deeply held faith that the universe was ordered by a higher power that cared about human morality and was capable of rendering judgment. This wasn't just medieval peasants being gullible. These beliefs were often supported by religious authorities and even codified in some legal systems. It was a framework for understanding the world, a way to seek truth when empirical methods were unavailable or unconceivable. It's almost charmingly naive in its belief in immediate divine feedback, isn't it? Like expecting a cosmic thumbs down on your questionable life choices. Now, while the specific combination of bread, wine, and candlelight for proving virginity is what we're focusing on, the underlying idea using ingestion or a physical reaction to reveal hidden truth has much deeper roots. People have long believed that the body itself held secrets, that physical symptoms could be manifestations of spiritual or moral states. There's a quirky historical tidbit here. In some ancient cultures, sneezing during a conversation was taken as a sign of divine affirmation of what was being said, while stumbling might indicate the opposite. It's a similar principle, just applied to different scenarios. The idea that the body, when subjected to something sacred or significant, would react involuntarily to reveal truth or falsehood was a recurring theme in human history long before anyone thought of using bread and wine for a purity test. This connection between physical reaction and hidden truth is a fascinating thread that runs through many ancient beliefs and practices, setting the stage for the specific ordeals we'll explore. The pressures and anxieties we're discussing created a demand for these kinds of tests. When a woman's reputation, her family's honor, and her future were on the line, and when formal legal structures might not offer recourse or might even mandate proof, turning to a spiritual ordeal seemed like a viable option. Imagine the desperation driving someone to subject themselves or their daughter to such a test. The whispers, the rumors, the potential for social ruin, it could be crushing. These tests weren't just random acts of weirdness. They arose from specific social needs and cultural beliefs about purity, honor, and divine justice. And while historians still argue whether these tests were primarily tools of social control, genuinely believe spiritual diagnostics, or a complex mix of both, their existence highlights the intense pressure surrounding female purity in historical societies. Whether they were effective in proving anything real is highly doubtful by modern standards, but their perceived effectiveness was enough to make them a part of the historical landscape. So, as we move forward, keep this backdrop in mind: a world anxious about lineage and honor, believing in divine judgment, and desperate for methods, however strange, to reveal hidden truths about personal conduct. This pressure cooker of societal expectation and spiritual belief is the soil from which the bizarre, quiet rituals of bread, wine, and candlelight emerged. They weren't just isolated incidents, they were part of a broader historical trend of using ordeals to settle disputes and reveal truths that human means alone could not verify. It's a testament to how far people would go and what strange rituals they would invent when faced with deeply ingrained fears and a profound belief in the supernatural. This is just the beginning of understanding that world, that pressure, and the very peculiar solutions people devise to cope with it. You're still standing there, aren't you? Feeling the echo of that historical anxiety about purity, about honor, about lineage. It's a heavy cloak draped over that dimly lit room. But as unsettling as the why behind these tests is, the how is even more compellingly strange. Because once societies decided they needed proof of something as elusive as past sexual conduct, they had to get creative. And one of the paths their creativity took was down the gullet, quite literally. Forget lie detector machines or psychological profiles. These folks were thinking about divine intervention manifesting through your digestive tract. Yes, we're talking about ordeals by ingestion. This wasn't just some fringe weirdness cooked up in a back alley. The idea that consuming something, often something with religious or symbolic significance, could reveal hidden truth or falsehood is a thread that runs through various cultures and legal systems across history. It's like a physical filter for your soul, or at least for your recent actions, with God or the gods doing the filtering. The logic was simple, if a bit flawed from a modern perspective. If you are pure, if you are innocent, if you are truthful, the sacred substance will not harm you, or it might even pass through you cleanly. But if you are guilty, deceitful, or impure, the substance will interact with your corrupted state, causing illness, swelling, difficulty swallowing, or some other obvious physical distress that everyone present could witness as a sign of divine condemnation. It's the ultimate cosmic allergy test, isn't it? Are you allergic to sin? Take a sip and see. One of the most well-known examples of this kind of thinking, a mainstream historical fact found in religious texts, is the ordeal of the bitter water, described in the Book of Numbers in the Hebrew Bible. This wasn't specifically a test for premarital virginity, but rather for a wife suspected of infidelity. The process is laid out with quite specific, almost ritualistic detail. A priest would take holy water, mix it with dust from the floor of the tabernacle, add some ink from writing curses onto a scroll, and washing it into the water. Charming, right? And then have the woman drink it. The belief was that if she was guilty, the water would cause her belly to swell and her thigh to rot. Graphic divine punishment. If she was innocent, she would be unharmed and be able to conceive children. It's a chilling example of how deeply ingrained the idea of using ingestion as a divine diagnostic tool was, even codified within a religious legal framework. It shows that the concept we're exploring tonight isn't just about obscure European practices. It's part of a much wider, ancient human tendency to seek supernatural verification of truth, especially when it came to perceived female sexual transgressions. Now, the ordeal of the bitter water involved curses and dust, which sounds frankly unpleasant. But the principle was key. Ingest a substance consecrated or prepared in a specific way, in a way to physical reaction interpreted as divine judgment. This principle shows up in different forms elsewhere. Think about some ancient Chinese practices for a quirky or fringe tidbit, where certain herbs or preparations were sometimes given to individuals under interrogation, with observers watching for subtle physical changes or difficulty speaking or swallowing, interpreted as signs of deceit. While not always framed as a direct divine ordeal, the underlying idea of the body betraying a hidden truth through ingestion is a common thread across various cultures, albeit applied differently. It's like an ancient polygraph test, but instead of wires, you're hooked up to the cosmic truth serum. The anxiety about purity, especially female purity, fueled the adaptation of these ingestion ordeal principles to the specific question of premarital status. If the body could reveal guilt or innocence in a criminal trial, or infidelity in a marriage, surely it could reveal whether a woman was a virgin? This felt like a logical extension of the belief system. After all, virginity was seen as a state of purity, a physical and spiritual intactness that, in their worldview, might react differently to sacred substances than a state of impurity or brokenness. It wasn't about detecting physical signs of intercourse. It was about detecting a moral or spiritual state through a physical test mediated by divine power. Imagine the scene again. You're there witnessing one of these tests. The tension is palpable. It's not like a modern court where evidence is presented and debated. It's quieter, more ritualistic. The focus is entirely on the person undergoing the test and their physical response. Every gulp, every wince, every tremor could be interpreted as a sign. This is where the psychological element becomes fascinating. Think about the immense pressure on someone undergoing such an ordeal, especially if they were genuinely anxious or knew they weren't a virgin according to the strict definition of the time. Stress and fear can cause a dry mouth, difficulty swallowing, nausea, shaking, shortness of breath. These are real physiological responses to extreme anxiety. In a culture predisposed to seeing divine signs everywhere, how easy would it be to misinterpret these stress symptoms as proof of guilt, as the sacred substance reacting negatively to impurity? It's a cruel feedback loop. You're terrified of failing the test because of divine judgment. Your terror causes physical symptoms, and those symptoms are then taken by one as proof of divine judgment. It's almost designed to confirm guilt in the anxious, isn't it? This brings up a point historians still argue whether these specific ingestion tests for virginity, distinct from general guilt or infidelity tests, were widely formalized or more often existed in folklore, local custom, or as one-off desperate measures. Were there official churches or courts routinely administering bread and wine tests for premarital purity? Or was it more of a folk belief, a method used by families in private, or something described in cautionary tales rather than legal statutes? It's difficult to pin down the exact prevalence and formality across different regions and time periods. Some records mention such practices, while others are silent. It's clear the anxiety about purity was widespread, and the principle of ingestion ordeals existed, but the specific application to premarital virginity with substances like bread and wine might have varied significantly in how common or institutionally sanctioned it was. Regardless of formal status, the belief in the possibility of such tests was real enough to shape people's lives. The threat, implicit or explicit, that divine judgment could be invoked and revealed through your body simply by swallowing something must have been terrifying. It adds another layer to that pressure cooker we talked about. Not only did you have to be pure, but you had to be able to prove it through a test that relied on supernatural favor and ignored the very human effects of fear and anxiety. These ingestion ordeals, whether formal or folkloric, provide the essential backdrop for understanding why bread and wine specifically might be chosen for a test of purity. Bread and wine, especially in Christian Europe where these tests are often documented, held profound religious significance. They were central to the sacrament of the Eucharist, representing the body and blood of Christ. They were seen as sacred substances imbued with divine power. What better vehicle in a religiously saturated world to invoke divine judgment than the very elements used in your most sacred rituals? If you were pure, if you were innocent, surely these holy substances would pass through you harmlessly, perhaps even blessedly. But if you were impure, if you had defiled your body in their view outside of marriage, wouldn't the sacred react violently to the profane? It was this potent combination of a widespread belief in ingestion as a method of divine judgment and the specific deep religious symbolism of bread and wine that likely led to their use in purity tests. They weren't just random items from the pantry, they were loaded with spiritual meaning, making them ideal candidates for an ordeal where the divine was expected to intervene. The stage was set, the method established, ingestion ordeal, and the key players identified, sacred substances. All that was left was the specific ritual and the equally symbolic element of candlelight, which we'll get to next. Think about it. In a world without scientific understanding of the body, without formal legal frameworks to handle every personal dispute, and with a profound belief in God's omnipresence and willingness to intervene between these kinds of ordeals made a strange kind of sense. They were a way to seek truth and justice when human means felt insufficient. They were dramatic, often public or at least witnessed, and seemed to offer a direct line to divine verification. While we might look back and shudder at the cruelty and the misinterpretation of basic human physiology, for the people living through it, these tests were a genuine attempt to navigate a complex world governed by strict social rules and even stricter beliefs about divine judgment. It's a peek into a mindset where the physical and the spiritual were intertwined in ways we can barely grasp today, where even eating a piece of bread or taking a sip of wine could become a matter of life, death, honor, and salvation. You're still wrestling with the weird logic of ingestion ordeals, that idea that your gut can somehow rat you out to God, right? And you're starting to see how substances like bread and wine, loaded with religious weight, became candidates for these strange tests. But how did the specific ritual play out? What did it look like, feel like, for the person undergoing this bizarre examination of their past? Imagine the setting. It's not a brightly lit room with clinical precision. It's probably dim, perhaps within a church, or a room in a house made solemn for the occasion. There would be witnesses, family members, maybe local clergy, elders, people whose opinions mattered intensely in your community. The air would be thick with expectation, hushed voices, the flickering light casting dancing shadows that only add to the tension. This isn't just a physical test. It's a performance, a public or semi-public drama where your future hinges on how your body reacts to something as simple as bread and wine. It feels less like a courtroom and more like a low-budget horror movie set where the monster is societal judgment and the special effects are your own anxiety. At the center of this hushed scene are the elements themselves: bread, wine, and a candle. The bread is often a small piece, sometimes described as dry, perhaps a bit of altar bread or bread consecrated for the purpose. The wine is typically red, symbolizing blood, and again might be consecrated or blessed. And the candle isn't just for illumination. It's another potent symbol. Light represents truth, purity, the presence of the divine. It illuminates the person's face, making any tremor, any difficulty swallowing, any physical sign excruciatingly visible to the waiting eyes. It's like putting you under a spotlight, but instead of applause, you're waiting for a gasp of condemnation or a sigh of relief. The ritual itself could vary, adding to the complexity historians face when trying to understand these practices, but the core often involved oaths and ingestion. You, the one whose purity is being questioned, would likely be required to swear a solemn oath affirming your virginity before God and the assembled witnesses. This oath would be heavy with religious weight, perhaps invoking curses upon yourself if you lied. Then you would be given the brema, the bread and the wine. Sometimes the bread was to be swallowed whole or chewed and swallowed quickly. The wine would be a sip, sometimes described as a bitter drink even before the curses that were washed into it, as in the ordeal of bitter water. The belief was that the sacredness of the substances, combined with the solemnity of the oath in the ritual, would activate divine judgment. If you had sworn falsely, if you were not a virgin, the holy elements would react against your impure state. The most common expected reaction was difficulty swallowing, specifically choking. Swallowing dry bread or even liquid can be hard under extreme stress and fear. Your throat tightens, your mouth goes dry, your muscles tense. And there, in the flickering candlelight, every strained gulp, every cough, every sign of discomfort was interpreted not as stress, but as God's hand, literally choking the lie in your throat. It's a particularly cruel interpretation, isn't it? Your body's natural fear response is weaponized against you. This wasn't the only form of ordeal by ingestion, of course. A mainstream historical fact is the widespread use of the corsned in Anglo-Saxon England, a type of consecrated bread or cheese used as an ordeal for suspected criminals, not specifically for virginity. The accused would eat the corsned after taking an oath of innocence. If they choked, sputtered, or showed any difficulty swallowing, it was considered proof of guilt. This shows the underlying principle: using consecrated food to reveal truth via physical reaction was firmly established in legal systems long before being potentially applied to purity tests. It wasn't a test unique to women or virginity, but the application of this general method to sexual purity highlights the specific anxieties around female sexuality. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, some descriptions of these tests, particularly in folklore or later accounts, talk about the bread being marked with a cross or other symbols, or the wine being prepared with specific prayers or even bizarre ingredients, though these are less substantiated than the core bread wine candle elements. There are even tales of the bread being so dry or the portion so large that it was meant to be difficult to swallow even if you were innocent, perhaps adding to the drama or ensuring that only the truly pure, aware, or perhaps the least anxious and most practiced at swallowing weird things under pressure, could pass. It adds a layer of almost theatrical cruelty to an already tense situation. Imagine trying to swallow a piece of desiccated toast the size of your fist while everyone stares, expecting you to choke. Gulp, literally. It's difficult to determine how formalized and widespread these specific bread, wine, and candlelight virginity tests were across different regions and social strata in medieval and early modern Europe. This brings up an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these rituals were common, officially sanctioned practices performed by religious authorities, or if they were more often informal folk customs, described in sensationalized accounts, or even cautionary tales used to control behavior rather than genuinely administered tests. While records mention ordeals, pinning down the frequency and specific methodology for premarital virginity, using these elements can be challenging due to limited primary sources and the potential for exaggeration in those that do exist. It's hard to build a solid statistical model of historical purity test frequency, sadly. The candle played more than just an illuminating role. In a world where life was often lived by the rhythms of natural light, a burning candle, especially in a solemn indoor setting, carried significant symbolic weight. It was a source of focused light against darkness, representing knowledge against ignorance, truth against deceit. Its steady flame, or perhaps flickering, adding to the drama, was like a silent witness, its presence invoking the idea that secrets could not remain hidden forever under the light of truth, whether that truth was considered divine or simply the consensus of the gathered community. It's like the earliest, most low-tech lie detector that relies entirely on atmospheric pressure and dramatic lighting. The ritual elements, the bread, the wine, the oath, the candle, the witnesses, all combined to create an environment of intense psychological pressure. Everything was designed to amplify anxiety. You were told that God himself would intervene. You were surrounded by people whose good opinion was vital to your future, and they were watching your every movement, waiting for a sign of guilt. You were being asked to ingest substances associated with the most sacred rituals under conditions that made swallowing inherently difficult. It's a recipe for triggering the very physical reactions that would be interpreted as failure. Think about the power dynamics here too. Who was administering these tests? Often men, priests, fathers, community leaders. Who was undergoing them? Almost always women. This highlights how deeply these tests were tied to controlling female sexuality and ensuring patriarchal control over lineage and property through perceived female chastity. The woman's body became the site of judgment, and her natural physiological responses were interpreted and judged by others, based on a set of beliefs she might not even fully understand or agree with, but from which she had no escape in that moment. These tests, in their various forms, whether the korsned, the bitter water, or the bread, wine, candle ritual, relied on a worldview where the physical body was a direct conduit for divine judgment. There was no concept of psychosomatic responses, no understanding of how fear could manifest physically. If your hand blistered from a hot iron ordeal, it was God saying you were guilty. If the consecrated bread choked you, it was God saying you were impure. It was a harsh, literal interpretation of cause and effect, filtered through religious belief and social control. And so you stand there, the small piece of bread in your hand, the cup of wine waiting. The candle flickers, casting long, unstable shadows. The eyes of the witnesses feel heavy upon you. You swallow dryly. This simple act, something you do countless times a day without thinking, is now freighted with immense significance. Your throat feels tight. Is that just nerves? Or is it us? The next section will delve into the most feared outcome of this bizarre ordeal, the act of choking itself and how that single, involuntary reaction could seal your fate. It's the moment the abstract anxiety about purity becomes a terrifyingly physical manifestation of supposed guilt. And so, you're standing there, heart pounding against your ribs like a trapped bird, the small piece of bread, dry as ancient parchment, it seems, poised in your hand. The wine waits, a silent, ruby judgment. The candle flickers, casting your anxious shadow onto the wall. Every eye in the room is fixed on you. The air is thick with the silent prayer of supporters and the perhaps not-so-silent hopes of detractors. You've just sworn the oath, the heavy words of divine invocation still echoing in the small space. Now comes the physical test. You raise the bread to your lips, swallowing. It's such an automatic process, isn't it? Something your body does dozens of times an hour without conscious thought. Your tongue moves the food back, your soft palate lifts, your epiglottis snaps shut over your windpipe, directing everything down the esophagus. Smooth, efficient, mindlessly reliable. Except when you're absolutely terrified. When fear grips you, your autonomic nervous system goes into overdrive. Your mouth can go bone dry. Your muscles tense, including those in your throat. Your breathing becomes shallow and rapid. All these things conspire to make that simple act of swallowing suddenly feel like trying to force a pebble through a straw. Imagine trying to swallow a piece of bread under that kind of spotlight. Your mouth is dry from stress, making the dry bread even harder to moisten. Your throat muscles are tight, making the passage feel constricted. Your breath hitches. You try to push the bread back with your tongue, but it feels like gravel. You swallow. It catches. You cough. You try again. Maybe it goes down with a painful scrape. Maybe it sticks fast, triggering a full-blown choking response. Every cough, every gasp, every flush of your face under the candle's glare is magnified, scrutinized. This isn't just a physical struggle. It's a public dissection of your perceived moral state. This difficulty swallowing, this terrifying physical response, was the linchpin of the whole ordeal. In the worldview that supported these tests, this wasn't seen as a natural reaction to extreme stress and fear. Oh no, it was interpreted quite literally as divine intervention. The belief was that the sacredness of the bread and wine, combined with the power of the oath and the invoked presence of God, would make it impossible for a liar to swallow. God, in their understanding, was physically preventing the impure person from internalizing the holy elements while simultaneously harboring a lie. The bread stuck because God himself was blocking the way down your throat. The wine wouldn't go down because divine power was causing you to gag on your deceit. It was a truly brutal interpretation, blaming the body's natural panic response on supernatural condemnation. Think about the absolute hopelessness of that situation. Your anxiety, something you have very little conscious control over in that moment, becomes irrefutable proof of your guilt. You might be the most virtuous, truthful person in the world, but if the sheer terror of the situation makes you choke on a crumb, you are instantly branded as a liar and impure. There's no appeal to reason, no understanding of physiology. The physical reaction is the verdict. It's like being sentenced based on whether you sweat during an interrogation. Though arguably, sweating might at least be easier to control than a full-blown gag reflex or under duress. The social consequences of failing this test, of choking or otherwise failing to easily swallow the bread and wine, were often devastating. This wasn't just a minor embarrassment. It was a public declaration of your supposed loss of virginity and your dishonesty. For a young woman in many historical societies, virginity was inextricably linked to honor, family reputation, and marriageability. To be deemed impure in this way could shatter your future prospects. You might be ostracized by your community. Your family could be shamed, their honor stained by your perceived transgression and failed test. Your chances of making a good, or sometimes any, marriage could vanish overnight. Remember how crucial marriage was for social and economic security for women? Suddenly that path is blocked. You might be subject to punishment, depending on the specific community's customs or any secular laws involved. This could range from public humiliation to potentially more severe sanctions, though specific legal punishments for failing just a virginity ordeal like this, as opposed to being found guilty of fornication through other means, are harder to pinpoint definitively across the board. The primary punishment was often the social ruin itself. A mainstream historical fact is that ordeals in general, while later condemned by the Church, notably the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which forbade clergy from participating, significantly reducing their practice, were for a time integrated into legal systems across medieval Europe, not just for sexual matters, but for serious crimes like theft, murder, and adultery. The idea that God would reveal truth through physical trial was a widely accepted, albeit controversial, legal principle. The ordeal by hot iron, by cold water, by combat, these were official means of determining guilt or innocence. Applying a similar principle to sexual purity, even if less formally or universally, fit within this broader framework of relying on divine judgment manifested physically. It's just another example of how these societies outsourced their judicial decisions to the Almighty, presumably saving on paperwork, but introducing a host of fairness issues. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, some accounts mention variations on the choking theme. For example, instead of just choking, failing might involve the bread or wine causing illness, swelling, or other unpleasant physical reactions. There are even tales of the bread being magically indigestible for the impure, or the wine turning bitter as gall. While choking is the most commonly described and physiologically plausible outcome under stress, these other variations, likely embellished in retellings, highlight the creative ways people imagine divine displeasure manifesting in the body. Imagine not just choking, but the bread swelling to twice its size in your throat. Talk about a bad review for dinner. This brings us to an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the outcome of these tests was primarily due to genuine, albeit misguided, faith in divine intervention leading to physical reactions, or if there was a significant element of manipulation or psychological coercion at play. Could people administering the test somehow make the bread harder to swallow for someone they suspected or disliked? Could the immense social pressure alone cause enough anxiety to trigger a failure, making the test inherently biased against the nervous? Was the belief in divine judgment so powerful that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy for the terrified individual? It's a complex interplay of faith, fear, and social control that's difficult to fully untangle centuries later. The power of suggestion cannot be underestimated here. You are told in no uncertain terms that if you lie, God will make you choke. You are in a highly charged environment, surrounded by judging eyes. Your body, naturally predisposed to a fight-or-flight response in stressful situations, interprets this as a threat. The physical symptoms of anxiety, dry mouth, tight throat, rapid heartbeat, mirror the very symptoms you're told are proof of guilt. It's a psychological trap. You might be terrified because the consequences of failing are so dire, and your very terror is then used as evidence against you. It's almost brilliant in its cruelty if you think about it in a detached, slightly horrified way. Consider the performance aspect again. Everyone is watching. You know what reaction they are looking for. Smooth, easy swallowing. You also know what reaction they are dreading or hoping for depending on their stake in the outcome. Coughing, sputtering, choking. The pressure to perform the simple act of swallowing flawlessly must have been immense. It's like being asked to tie your shoes perfectly while a panel of stern judges stares at your hands, ready to declare you a moral failure if your laces get tangled. The consequences rippled outwards. Not only was your own life potentially ruined, but your family's status could be diminished. Future marriage prospects for siblings might be affected. Inheritance could be complicated. The shame attached to a failed test could be long-lasting, following you and potentially your relatives for years. In communities where reputation and honor were paramount, this was a devastating blow. It wasn't just about personal purity, it was about the social fabric and the intricate web of relationships and obligations that held everything together. The idea of the body betraying the soul or revealing hidden truth was deeply ingrained in many historical belief systems. The ordeal of bitter water mentioned earlier from the book of Numbers in the Bible, where a woman suspected of adultery is given a bitter potion that will supposedly cause her belly to swell and thigh to rot if she is guilty, is an ancient precursor to this concept. While different in specifics, the core principle is the same. Ingesting something consecrated or special will cause a physical reaction that indicates guilt or innocence regarding a sexual transgression. It's a long, uncomfortable history of using women's bodies as truth tellers, interpreted by others. And so, the moment of truth arrives. You take the piece of bread, maybe dip it in the wine, as some descriptions suggest, or perhaps swallow them separately. You try to control your breathing, to moisten your dry mouth, to relax your throat, but the fear is a cold knot in your stomach, a vice around your windpipe. You swallow. The gathered witnesses lean forward, their eyes intent. The candle flickers, illuminating the tension etched on every face. Did it go down smoothly, or did you cough? Did you gasp? Did the bread stick? This physical reaction, or lack thereof, is about to determine your fate. The next section will explore the aftermath of this terrifying moment, regardless of the outcome, and how the community processed the results of this bizarre test. The air hangs heavy, thick, with unspoken thoughts and held breaths after you perform the act. Did the bread slide down easily? Did the wine flow smoothly? Or was there a catch, a choke, a cough that ripped through the silence like tearing fabric? Everyone is watching, their faces a mixture of anticipation, relief, suspicion, or perhaps even disappointment. The candle flame seems to lean with the collective tension in the room, casting long, dancing shadows that make the witnesses look like restless, ancient figures. The immediate aftermath depends entirely on how you swallowed. If it was smooth, effortless, a gentle, almost automatic process as it should be, there's a collective exhale. A murmur goes through the crowd. Your supporters might let out a quiet cheer, perhaps step forward, their faces breaking into smiles. You feel a wave of relief so intense it makes your knees weak. You passed. You ingested the consecrated elements, without divine impediment. This was interpreted as God affirming your truthfulness and therefore your purity. If, however, you coughed, choked, gagged, or sputtered, if that simple piece of bread stuck in your throat or the wine came back up, the atmosphere shifts instantly. The murmurs are different now. They're whispers, sharp and critical. Faces harden. Your supporters might shrink back, their earlier hope turning to dismay or even anger. Detractors might smirk, a cruel satisfaction playing on their lips. The judgment is swift and harsh. You failed. The difficulty in swallowing is seen not as a result of paralyzing fear, which it almost certainly was, but as a direct sign of divine wrath proving your deceit and your impurity. The pronouncement of the outcome would likely fall to a respected figure present, perhaps a local elder, the person who administered the oath, or the head of the household or community holding the test. There wasn't a standardized courtroom procedure, remember? This was often a community-level, sometimes familial test. They would interpret your physical reaction and declare the verdict aloud. "She has passed" would ring out for a smooth swallow, followed by expressions of joy and congratulations. "She has failed," spoken in a solemn or condemning tone, would follow a struggle, sealing your fate. The public nature of this declaration was crucial. The community wasn't just witnessing a test, they were hearing the verdict delivered and internalizing it as truth. The consequences for passing, while certainly preferable to failing, weren't necessarily a walk in the park either. You were vindicated, yes, your honor was restored or confirmed. For a young woman, this often meant her marriage prospects, which might have been on hold or jeopardized by the accusation, were now secured. The potential shame to your family was averted. You were, in the eyes of the community, proven pure and truthful regarding the specific claim tested. This could lead to celebrations, reaffirmation of social standing, and proceeding with life as planned, free from the specific cloud of that accusation. Imagine the sheer exhausting relief after such an ordeal. You didn't just survive a terrifying public test, you won it. Time for a nap, maybe, or perhaps a very soft, easily swallowed meal. But the shadow of the accusation and the public nature of the test might still linger. Even if you passed, people might still remember that you were suspected enough to warrant such a test. And historians still argue whether passing these ordeals truly cleared a name entirely, or if a faint whisper of doubt could persist in the back of people's minds. Was the relief of passing absolute or just the best possible outcome in a terrible situation? It's likely the degree of lasting impact varied greatly depending on the community, the severity of the original accusation, and your social standing. Now for failing, this is where the true devastation lay. If you choked, you were, in the eyes of the community and potentially religious authorities, a proven liar and impure. The social consequences were immediate and often catastrophic. You were shamed publicly. Your reputation was ruined. For a woman accused of losing her virginity outside of marriage, this was incredibly damaging. Her marriageability plummeted, often to zero. Families might disown or severely ostracize a daughter who failed, both out of genuine belief in her guilt and to protect their own reputation. This leads to a mainstream historical fact. While legal systems varied, the concept of honor and shame was a powerful social currency across many historical cultures, particularly concerning women's sexuality. Virginity before marriage was often seen as crucial for maintaining not just a woman's individual honor, but that of her entire family lineage. Ordeals like the bread and wine test tap directly into the societal value system, using the body as a supposed indicator of this vital social commodity. Failing wasn't just a personal failing, it was an economic and social disaster for the family unit. It's almost like crashing the family car, but instead of insurance premiums going up, your entire social standing vanishes in a puff of shame. A quirky or fringe tidbit about failing is that in some regional folklore or later retellings, the physical consequences of failing were sometimes described as intensifying after the test. Tales might circulate that the failed person continued to have difficulty swallowing, or develop strange ailments, or that the bread remained stuck in their throat forever, a gruesome supernatural punishment for their deceit. These are likely exaggerated legends, reflecting the community's desire to see continued, visible proof of divine judgment on the guilty party, reinforcing the perceived legitimacy of the test itself. Consider the psychological torment of someone who is genuinely innocent but fails the test due to fear. Their body's involuntary stress response is weaponized against them. They know they are truthful, yet they are publicly declared a liar by what is presented as a divine mechanism. This conflict between internal truth and external, religiously sanctioned proof must have been agonizing. You are simultaneously innocent and proven guilty. It's enough to make anyone question their sanity, let alone their fate. The severity of punishment for failing could vary. As mentioned before, the primary consequence was social ruin. However, depending on the context of the accusation, e.g., if it was part of a larger charge like adultery, legal or physical punishments could theoretically follow, though the bread and wine test itself was often more of a community religious proof than a formal legal step in many places. Still, the social death it imposed could be more crushing than any physical punishment. Imagine being alive, but everyone around you acts as if you are not only dead, but dead and disgraced. The role of witnesses was paramount. They weren't just passive observers, they were the jury. Their interpretation of your reaction, guided by the belief system underpinning the ordeal, determined the outcome. They would scrutinize every twitch, every gasp. Their collective agreement on whether your swallow was smooth or labored solidified the verdict. This highlights how these tests were deeply embedded in community dynamics and shared faith. The test wasn't just between you and God, it was between you and God as interpreted by the people watching you. Talk about performance pressure. Did you remember to blink naturally? Because maybe that's proof of guilt too. Okay, probably not, but you get the idea of the scrutiny. This public spectacle and its devastating potential consequences served as a powerful deterrent, or at least were intended to. The fear of failing, of the public shame and ruin, might have encouraged confessions from genuinely guilty parties. Though maybe not if they thought they could bluff it or were just stubborn. More likely, it instilled a deep anxiety around any potential accusations and the terrifying prospect of having to undergo such a test. The test itself, regardless of the outcome, was a form of social control, reinforcing norms around sexuality and truthfulness through fear. As you reflect on the tension, the swallow, and the immediate aftermath, the joy of the vindicated or the despair of the condemned, the picture of this bizarre practice becomes clearer. It wasn't merely a quaint historical custom, it was a high-stakes performance where your body's involuntary reactions under extreme stress dictated your social identity and future. The next section will delve deeper into the witnesses, the community, and their crucial active role in making these ordeals function as mechanisms of judgment and social control. So the moment passes, the bread is swallowed or it isn't, the wine goes down or it comes back up. But your performance, or rather your involuntary reaction under pressure, is only half the story. The other, arguably more powerful half, rests entirely with the people watching you, the witnesses. They aren't just an audience. They are the crucible in which the outcome is forged. Imagine yourself there, not undergoing the test, but standing among the crowd. You feel the tension, the quiet anticipation that hums in the air. Your eyes are fixed on the person taking the oath, watching their face, their hands, their throat. You see them reach for the bread, feel the weight of it in their hand. You watch them put it in their mouth, chew or attempt to chew, and then try to swallow. You listen intently for any sound, a gulp, a choke, a capo. You observe the wine, the way it's lifted, tilted, and whether it disappears smoothly or if there's a sudden cough, a splutter, liquid dripping from the corner of the mouth. This wasn't passive viewing, it was active judgment. Your interpretation of what you saw and heard was critical. And your interpretation wasn't just based on a medical understanding of stress or anxiety. It was filtered through a deeply held belief system that Guatemala or divine power would intervene physically in the guilty to prevent them from successfully completing the action after swearing a false oath. A smooth swallow wasn't just good swallowing, it was a sign of divine favor, a physical manifestation of truthfulness. A choke wasn't just nerves, it was divine impediment, proof of a lie. Think about the collective weight of all these individual interpretations converging. You, as a witness, see a slight cough. The person next to you sees a violent choke. Someone else sees a momentary hesitation. But the overall atmosphere, the reactions of the more influential people present, and the prevailing belief about the test's efficacy would guide the consensus. If the person administering the test or a respected community leader declared, "They struggled. It is plain the divine power prevented them," it would reinforce everyone's tendency to interpret any difficulty as proof of guilt. Similarly, if the swallow seemed effortless, the collective sigh of relief and murmurs of approval would solidify the perception of innocence. This is where the social aspect becomes paramount. The bread and wine ordeal, like many other ordeals by test in history, relied heavily on community consensus for its validity. It wasn't a scientific experiment where objective results were measured. It was a ritual where the shared faith and interpretive framework of the witnesses transformed a physical event into a moral verdict. The community made the verdict real through their collective affirmation. They were, in effect, co-creators of the truth in that moment. It's like if everyone in your friend group decided that spilling coffee is proof you're lying about something. If enough people believe it and react accordingly, suddenly you're very careful about your caffeine consumption when you're telling a story. A mainstream historical fact here is that judicial and quasi-judicial ordeals were common across many cultures and time periods precisely because they leveraged the power of collective belief and community validation. From trial by water, where the innocent were supposed to sink and the guilty float, or vice versa, depending on the specific belief system, to trial by hot iron, where a clean wound indicated innocence, these tests weren't about physical proof in a modern sense, but about interpreting physical reactions through a lens of divine intervention or supernatural signs, with the community acting as the jury of interpretation and enforcement. The bread and wine test fits squarely into this tradition of seeking divine judgment through physical means, validated by communal faith. The witnesses also had a responsibility to maintain the sanctity of the ritual. They were expected to be quiet, respectful, and focused. Any disruption could be seen as interfering with the divine process. Their presence wasn't just to observe the accused, but also, implicitly, to bear witness to God's judgment. They were participants in a sacred or at least highly ritualized event designed to reveal truth. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit related to the witnesses. There are some scattered historical accounts or legal texts that mention provisions for dealing with witnesses who were suspected of colluding with the accused, perhaps by secretly giving them something beforehand to make swallowing easier, or by deliberately misinterpreting the physical reaction. These rules, often found in very specific legal codes or local customs, highlight the awareness that the witnesses could influence the outcome and that their honesty and adherence to the ritual were considered just as important as the accused person's performance. It's almost like having rules against the jury taking bribes, but the bribe is a cough drop. Historians still argue whether the power of suggestion and social pressure on the witnesses themselves played a larger role than genuine belief in divine intervention. Did people truly believe that a struggle was a sign from God? Or were they simply conforming to societal expectations in interpreting events in a way that reinforced existing community norms and power structures? Was the outcome decided by faith, or by the subtle or not so subtle cues from the community leaders and the prevailing mood of the crowd? This is a fascinating layer of complexity to these historical practices. Consider the psychological pressure on the witnesses. They weren't just watching, they were implicitly asked to participate in potentially condemning or vindicating a fellow community member. If you genuinely saw a struggle but everyone else insisted it was smooth, would you speak up? Your reputation, your standing in the community, might depend on interpreting the event in the same way as the majority, especially if that majority included powerful figures. Silence could be a form of assent, allowing the collective interpretation to override individual perception. It was a system that reinforced conformity. The community's role extended beyond simply observing the physical act. They were the ones who raised the initial accusation or supported the person being tested. They were the ones who would enforce the consequences of the outcome, the social ostracism, the loss of standing, or conversely, the acceptance and reintegration. The ordeal wasn't an abstract legal proceeding. It was a community event with tangible, community-enforced results. The witnesses weren't just onlookers. They were the active agents of social consequence. It's like they weren't just watching a sports match. They were also the referees, the commentators, and the fans who collectively decide if the goal counts. The sheer number of witnesses mattered too. A public ordeal in a village square or outside a church involved potentially dozens, if not hundreds of eyes. The more people who saw the same event and interpreted it the same way, the harder it was for anyone to dispute the outcome. This public nature solidified the truth revealed by the ordeal in the community's collective memory. It wasn't just a private judgment, it was a public declaration, witnessed and affirmed by all. And while the belief was in divine judgment, the practicalities of the test meant human perception and interpretation were always at play. Was the bread dry? Was the wine thick? Was the accused person genuinely ill or just terrified? These factors, which might cause swallowing difficulty entirely unrelated to guilt, would be filtered through the communal belief that any difficulty was divine intervention. The system was designed to leave little room for alternative explanations, at least officially. Unofficially, historians might argue that quiet doubts always lingered. So as you step back from being the one undergoing the test and look out at the sea of watching faces, you understand the immense power they held. Your fate wasn't just in your throat or in the hands of a divine power. It was in the eyes and the collective interpretation of your community. Their gaze, their whispers, their eventual pronouncements. That is what sealed your innocence or your shame. And the enduring memory of that public moment would shape your life, for good or ill, long after the bread and wine were gone. The next step, then, after the gasp of relief or the cry of despair, was the formal declaration and the beginning of living with the consequences. The collective breath held by the crowd finally releases, not in a gentle exhale, but in a sudden rush of sound. It's a murmur that swells into distinct reactions, perhaps a collective gasp and hushed whisper if you choked, or a wave of murmurs and nods of approval if you swallowed cleanly. The tension that bound everyone together for those excruciating moments snaps, replaced by the immediate weight of the declared outcome. Your performance, interpreted by the community, now has a name: innocent or guilty. The formal declaration isn't delivered by a judge in a black robe and wig. You're probably not in a courtroom like you'd see on TV, even if that's where your modern brain goes first. More likely, it's the person who administered the test, perhaps a priest, a local lord, a village elder, or whoever held authority in this particular setting. Their voice cutting through the crowd noise. The ordeal has revealed. They might begin, or perhaps, by the grace of God, as witnessed by this community. The exact phrasing varies, but the purpose is clear: to officially pronounce the verdict based on the outcome of the bread and wine. This is the moment the communal interpretation solidifies into recorded fact, or at least into accepted truth within the community's memory and social structure. It's no longer just individuals watching and whispering, it's the community speaking with one voice, echoing the collective judgment. The declaration doesn't just announce the result, it imprints it onto your life and your standing. Think of it like getting your exam results posted on a public bulletin board, but instead of a letter grade, it's your moral standing, and the whole town is looking. Awkward. If the verdict is innocent, a wave of relief washes over you, and perhaps over your family or supporters in the crowd. There might be sighs, maybe even quiet cheers. The person who accused you, assuming there was a specific accuser rather than just suspicion, might now face consequences themselves, perhaps a fine or public shaming for making a false accusation. You are cleared, your reputation is restored, and you can, at least theoretically, return to your life. There might be handshakes, pats on the back, murmured apologies from those who doubted you. You've passed the test, not just of your throat, but of your virtue in the eyes of your peers, and, they believed, of a higher power. However, if the verdict is guilty, the atmosphere shifts chillingly. The murmurs turn to gasps of condemnation, or perhaps a stony, silent disapproval that feels heavier than any sound. The person who pronounced the verdict might deliver it with gravitas, perhaps adding a sermonizing note about the dangers of sin and deceit. Your accuser, if present, might look triumphant, and the consequences begin immediately. These consequences varied greatly depending on the time period, the place, and the nature of the accusation. They weren't usually execution or imprisonment in the way we think of it for minor offenses. Instead, they often focused on social and economic penalties. You might be fined heavily, losing property or possessions. You could be subjected to public penance, perhaps having to stand outside the church during services for a period, or make a public apology. More severe consequences could involve banishment from the community or the loss of your legal rights and protections, essentially making you an outcast, vulnerable, and without recourse. Consider the ripple effects of a guilty verdict. It wouldn't just affect you, it would impact your family. Your spouse, children, and even close relatives might share in the shame and social stigma. Your ability to earn a living could be severely hampered if your trade or status depended on your reputation within the community. Business partners might abandon you, friends turn away, neighbors treat you with suspicion or outright hostility. The declared guilt, based on that physical reaction to bread and wine, could unravel the fabric of your entire life. It wasn't just a legal judgment, it was a social expulsion. It's like getting unfriended by your entire town on Facebook. But the town is real, and there's no block button. A mainstream historical fact related to this stage is that the consequences of judicial ordeals often blurred the lines between religious, legal, and social penalties. In many medieval societies, for example, the church played a significant role in judicial processes, and penalties for guilt revealed by ordeal could include spiritual penance or alongside temporal punishments like fines or banishment. The goal wasn't just punishment in a modern correctional sense, but atonement, restoration of community harmony, often at the expense of the guilty party, and reaffirmation of the divine order believed to underpin justice. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit about the aftermath, there are some accounts, though not widespread or uniformly accepted, that suggest in certain contexts if the accused was declared guilty by ordeal, but the community felt the accusation was weak or the person was otherwise respected, there might be informal ways for them to mitigate the consequences or reintegrate over time, perhaps through extraordinary acts of penance or charity. This hints at the human element still existing beneath the formal ritual. Communities weren't always monolithic in their adherence to the outcome, especially when personal relationships or local politics were involved. It suggests the formal verdict wasn't always the absolute final word in how someone was treated long-term, offering a glimmer of potential, if unofficial, redemption. It's like getting a bad Yelp review, but your regulars still sneak you free appetizers. Historians still argue whether the formal declaration of guilt or innocence by ordeal truly resolved disputes and restored harmony, or simply created a new set of tensions and resentments. Did the ritual genuinely satisfy the community's need for justice and certainty? Or did the arbitrary nature of the outcome, particularly in cases where the accused seemed genuinely distressed but was declared guilty, sow seeds of doubt and mistrust in the system itself? This is a crucial point of debate. Was the ordeal a tool for communal cohesion or another source of division and potential injustice? If you were declared innocent, while you might feel relief, the experience itself would likely leave scars. The public humiliation of being suspected, the terror of the test, the uncertainty of the outcome, that doesn't just disappear. You've been exposed, vulnerable, subjected to intense scrutiny. The memory of those watching eyes and the moment your fate hung in the balance would likely stay with you, perhaps making you more cautious, more aware of your place in the community, in the ease with which it could be threatened. And if you were declared guilty, your path forward was bleak. You wouldn't just be living with the external consequences, the bêtises, the banishment, the shunning. You'd be living with the internal burden of being officially labeled a liar, and in the eyes of many, someone rejected by divine power. The psychological toll would be immense. You might internalize the guilt, believing that God truly did prevent you from swallowing, even if you knew you were telling the truth but were simply overcome by fear. Or you might harbor deep resentment towards the system, the accuser, and the community that condemned you. The aftermath wasn't just about the legal or social penalties. It was about the narrative that became attached to you. If innocent, you became a testament to divine justice and your own virtue, a story of vindication. If guilty, you became a cautionary tale, an example of deceit exposed, a living embodiment of the consequences of lying. This narrative would shape how people interacted with you or avoided you for years to come. It was the final enduring layer of the ordeal, not just the verdict, but the story the community told about you afterwards. And that story began the moment the declaration was made, echoing through the square, through the village, and into the future. So you've endured the ordeal, whether you passed with the clean swallow of the innocent or failed with a choked gasp of the guilty. That moment under the candlelight, with the bread and wine, is over. The immediate judgment has been delivered. The whispers have either softened into relief or sharpened into condemnation. But this wasn't just a single scary event. The outcome of that ordeal, particularly one about something as fundamental as your perceived purity or honesty, would ripple out and define much of your life afterward. If you were among the fortunate, the ones whose bodies didn't betray them, or whose anxiety was read as righteous fear, you were declared innocent. Publicly, legally, you were cleared. There might have been celebrations, perhaps a feast to mark your vindication, restoring honor to your family. You could ostensibly resume your life. Marriage plans that were put on hold could now potentially proceed. Your standing in the community, so recently jeopardized, was reaffirmed. It sounds like a happy ending, right? Except, you know what you went through. You know the terror that gripped you. You stood there convinced that your very physical reactions, perhaps uncontrollable ones caused by sheer panic, were going to damn you. And while you were declared innocent, the ordeal didn't erase the memory of the accusation or the public spectacle. People might have whispered beforehand, and even after you passed, there might still be lingering doubts for some, the kind of quiet, "Oh, well, they did look awfully nervous, didn't they?" Murmurs that cling like smoke. You might find it hard to fully trust the people who accused you, or even those who watch with eager anticipation. The community that gathered to see if you'd choke, well, you saw them at their most judgmental. How do you go back to sharing meals, to attending church, to feeling truly safe among them? The social reintegration, even for the innocent, could be fraught. You were proven innocent by the standards of the time, but the psychological price was high. It's like being acquitted after a sensational trial. You're free, but everyone still knows your name and what you were accused of. You carry that burden. Your family too would bear the mark. Your vindication cleared their name, but the ordeal itself was a public humiliation they shared. They might be relieved, but also perhaps resentful of the fear and anxiety you put them through. Relationships within the family might be strained. And for you personally, the experience could lead to a deep-seated aversion to being the center of attention or trigger anxiety in stressful situations. You might forever associate certain foods, certain lights, or even just moments of intense scrutiny with that terrifying test. You survived the ordeal, but did you survive it intact? Probably not without some invisible scars. It's like being told you're fine after a car crash, while ignoring the whiplash and the sudden fear you feel every time a truck passes. Now, let's shift to the grim reality of failing. If the bread stuck, if you coughed, if you fainted, if any of those reactions were interpreted as divine judgment against you, your life changed instantly and irrevocably. You were declared guilty, not just by human consensus, but by God himself, according to the beliefs of the era. This was not a finding that could be easily challenged or appealed. The consequences varied, as we touched on in Section 7, depending on the accusation and local law. For a charge related to virginity or sexual conduct deemed illicit, failing the ordeal meant profound and often permanent social ruin. You might be cast out by your family, who would see you as a source of shame and dishonor. You would likely be ostracized by the community, unable to participate in social gatherings, perhaps even denied access to certain religious rites. Marriage would be out of the question, particularly if virginity was a prerequisite for women, which it often was. Beyond social exclusion, there were often legal penalties. Public shaming was common, being paraded through the streets, perhaps stripped or forced to wear a humiliating symbol. Flogging, branding, or other forms of physical punishment might be inflicted. In some cases, and depending on the specific charge, like adultery, or if the lack of virginity was tied to a more serious crime like seduction under false pretenses, the penalty could be death. Execution wasn't usually part of the ordeal itself, but it was the grim consequence delivered by secular authorities based on the ordeal's divine verdict. It's like being found guilty by a jury and then facing the electric chair. Only the jury was a piece of stale bread, even if you survived the immediate legal consequences. Finding a way to live was incredibly difficult. How do you earn a living when your reputation is destroyed? How do you find shelter or support when your family has disowned you and the community shuns you? You might be forced into begging, into marginal existence on the fringes of society, or even into exile from your home village or town. The stigma was often intergenerational. Your family might carry the shame of your failure for years, potentially impacting the marriage prospects or social standing of your siblings or other relatives. Failing the ordeal wasn't just a personal disaster. It was a family and social catastrophe. It reinforced the community's beliefs about sin, judgment, and the absolute necessity of adhering to strict moral codes. Your ruined life served as a terrifying example, a living or perhaps deceased testament to the perceived consequences of perceived transgression. There was very little chance of rehabilitation or forgiveness once the ordeal had rendered its verdict. You were, quite literally, marked for life by the outcome of a test you had minimal control over. Mainstream historical fact: following the decline of judicial ordeals after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, legal systems in Europe gradually transitioned towards more evidence-based procedures, including the increased use of witness testimony, documentary evidence, and eventually the development of trial by jury or inquisitorial methods. However, the legacy of ordeal thinking, where judicial outcomes were seen as reflecting divine will or moral character rather than purely legal principles, persisted in various forms for centuries. A quirky or fringe tidbit. While ordeals faded from formal legal systems, the idea of seeking a sign of guilt or innocence through physical means lingered in folk practices and superstitions. For example, the belief that a murderer's presence would cause a corpse to bleed, often called the beer rite, persisted in some areas long after judicial ordeals were abolished, demonstrating how deeply ingrained the concept of divine or supernatural revelation of guilt was. It's like trading your formal lie detector for a magic 8-ball, but with dead bodies. Historians still argue whether the social function of ordeals was primarily to provide a definitive, albeit arbitrary, means of resolving disputes in societies lacking other reliable methods, or if they served a more insidious purpose as a tool for reinforcing religious authority and social conformity through fear and spectacle. Was it a necessary, if flawed, legal mechanism for its time, or was it primarily a performance of power designed to keep people in line by threatening them with divine judgment manifested through arbitrary physical tests? The motivations behind their widespread adoption and the reasons for their eventual decline remain complex and debated. Whether you passed or failed, Mimai, the ordeal by bread, wine, and candlelight was a traumatic, life-altering event. It wasn't just a test. It was a public declaration of your moral and spiritual standing in the eyes of your community and your God. For those who passed, life resumed, but forever shadowed by the memory of the test and the fragility of their vindication. For those who failed, life often became a grim struggle for survival on the margins, a stark warning to others about the perceived consequences of straying from the path, a permanent symbol of shame ordained by ritual. And so, after you've faced that flickering judgment, leaving you either trembling with relief or utterly broken by the verdict of the bread, wine, and candlelight, the world outside the immediate ordeal kept turning. While your life might have been irrevocably altered in that moment, the system that subjected you to such a test was itself starting to feel the tremors of change. It wasn't a sudden collapse, more like a slow geological shift. But eventually, the ground beneath these divine trials began to give way. You see, even back then, tucked away in dusty monasteries or debating in early universities, there were people with doubts. Quiet whispers grew into louder arguments against the ordeal system. Was it truly God intervening in every single case, making the bread stick or the hot iron burn just so every single time? Or was it coincidence, manipulation, or simply the unpredictable nature of human bodies under extreme stress? Clergy, who were often required to bless the instruments of the ordeal or be present to observe, started feeling increasingly uncomfortable. They were supposed to be administering sacraments, focused on spiritual matters, not presiding over what looked suspiciously like a test of divine luck or physical fortitude dressed up as justice. It felt undignified, perhaps even sacrilegious, to demand that God perform a miracle on cue just to settle a dispute about who stole a chicken or indeed someone's marital eligibility. Imagine asking the Almighty to step in and make sure someone chokes just because their neighbor thinks they lied. It's a bit much, isn't it? Like expecting a celestial flash mob every time someone runs a red light. This growing discomfort wasn't just a feeling, it became official policy. A pivotal moment arrived in the year 1215. Try to picture it. Pope Innocent III, a rather powerful and influential figure, convened one of the most important church councils of the Middle Ages, the Fourth Lateran Council in Rome. Representatives from across the Catholic world gathered, bishops and abbots and theologians, to discuss everything from doctrine to discipline. And among the many decrees they issued, one small but incredibly significant canon, Canon 18 if you're keeping score, addressed judicial ordeals directly. It didn't outright forbid the ordeal itself because the church was often cautious about directly interfering with secular law, but it did something that effectively crippled the system's legitimacy. It prohibited clergy from administering, blessing, or even being present at judicial ordeals involving consecrated elements or rituals. Think about the bread and wine ordeal you might have gone through. Who brought the elements? Likely a priest. Who blessed them, making them holy and thus, in the belief of the time, capable of carrying divine judgment? A priest. Who oversaw the solemn ritual, lending it spiritual weight and authority. Again, the clergy. By removing the priests from the picture, the Fourth Lateran Council essentially said, fine, you can do your hot iron thing or your bread thing, but don't expect us to lend God's authority to it anymore. It was like taking the batteries out of the divine lie detector. Without the clergy, the ordeal was stripped of its most convincing claim, that it was a direct manifestation of God's will. It became harder to argue that a stuck piece of bread was divine judgment when the person who blessed the bread and was supposed to interpret the sign wasn't even there. The impact of this decree wasn't immediate everywhere, of course. Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, lordships, and legal customs, and news traveled slowly. But gradually the decree spread and secular authorities found it increasingly difficult to justify using ordeals. If the church, the ultimate authority on divine matters, was distancing itself from these tests, how could they still be considered reliable ways to discover God's truth? It would be like relying on a medieval version of Yelp reviews after the main critic decided they were just reviewing indigestion instead of food quality. Ordeals, particularly those requiring priestly involvement, like the Eucharistic ordeal you faced, began to fade from formal legal practice in many regions, especially in England and parts of France and Germany, over the following decades and centuries. So, if you lived after 1215, the terrifying possibility of facing the bread and wine ordeal, or the hot iron or cold water, became less and less likely in official court settings. But what replaced it? Well, justice had to carry on. With the divine shortcut removed, legal systems had to become more human. They began to rely more heavily on methods that required people to actually gather information, question witnesses, and analyze evidence. One of the key alternatives that gained prominence was witness testimony. Before, witnesses might have been used, but their accounts were often treated with suspicion or weighed less heavily than the outcome of an ordeal, which was seen as God's infallible word. After the decline of ordeals, courts had to develop ways to assess the credibility of witnesses. Oaths became more formalized and solemn, swearing to tell the truth. So help me God wasn't just a formality, it was a serious religious act, with the belief that lying under oath risked divine punishment, albeit a less immediate and dramatic form than choking on bread. People started paying more attention to things like a witness's reputation, their relationship to the parties involved, and the consistency of their story. It was a step, however small, towards what we might recognize today as relying on human observation and honesty rather than hoping for a divine sign. Another crucial development was the increased reliance on documentary evidence. As literacy rates slowly rose, though still low by modern standards, and administrative practices improved, written records became more common. Charters, contracts, receipts, registers of land ownership, these pieces of paper, once rare and fragile, began to hold weight in legal disputes. It's harder to argue with a signed document than with a piece of bread, unless maybe the bread has a really convincing autograph baked into it. Courts started looking at the proof contained in these documents, adding another layer to the process of seeking truth. In some parts of Europe, particularly on the continent, legal procedures began to evolve towards what's known as the inquisitorial system. This wasn't the Spanish Inquisition, that came later and was primarily focused on heresy, but a legal method where the judge or court actively took responsibility for investigating the case, gathering evidence, and questioning the parties involved, rather than just acting as an umpire between two sides presenting their case, as in an adversarial system, which ordeals somewhat resembled. You accuse someone, they underwent the test. This shift meant judges had to become more skilled in legal reasoning and evidence evaluation. In England, a different path was taken, leading towards the development of trial by jury. Initially, early juries weren't judging guilt or innocence based on presented evidence. They were often locals who were already supposed to know the facts of the case, acting more like witnesses. But over time, the concept evolved. Juries began to hear evidence presented by others, witnesses, documents, and base their verdict on that human-provided information, rather than their own prior knowledge or the outcome of an ordeal. It was a gradual evolution, from a community test of knowledge to a community judgment based on presented facts. You might be thinking, okay, so ordeals went away, but were these new methods really better? That's a fair question. They were certainly less reliant on arguably arbitrary divine intervention and less physically brutal, mostly. But the early versions of witness testimony and documentary evidence were still far from perfect. Assessing credibility was subjective, documents could be forged, and the process was often slow and complex. Plus, while the ordeal of the hot iron was gone, other forms of what might be considered ordeal-like practices lingered for a while, like trial by battle, especially for resolving disputes between nobles or in certain types of criminal cases. In a trial by battle, the outcome of a fight between the accused and the accuser, or their champions, was seen as God's judgment. It was another form of seeking divine intervention through a physical contest, though perhaps less universal than the ordeals like bread or water. It's like replacing a coin flip with a wrestling match. Still a bit chaotic, but hey, at least you get a workout. Trial by battle persisted in England until the early 19th century, though it was rarely used by then, a strange echo of the old ways in a world of lawyers and written laws. The decline of ordeals and the rise of more evidence-based systems didn't happen in a vacuum. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of this massive shift was theological discomfort, the Church's decree, the rise of more centralized state power, kings wanting more control over justice, the development of legal scholarship and universities teaching Roman and canon law, or simply the practical problems and inherent unfairness of the ordeal system itself. Was it the Pope pulling the plug, or kings wanting a more reliable system they could manage, or smart people in schools figuring out better ways? Or just everyone eventually agreeing that asking God to make someone choke on bread wasn't a great legal standard? It was probably a combination of all these factors, but the exact weight of each remains a fascinating area of scholarly debate. Regardless of the specific cause, the change was profound. You were slowly moving from a world where justice was sought through asking God for a sign via a physical test to a world where justice was sought through human reason, observation, and the interpretation of evidence. It was a slow, often messy transition, with elements of the old thinking sometimes creeping into the new methods, like the solemnity of oaths or the lingering belief in divine retribution for perjury. But for you, had you lived through this era, the possibility of your fate being decided by whether you could swallow a piece of blessed bread under pressure would become, over time, a relic of a fading, more arbitrary age of justice. You'd be less likely to stand in the flickering candlelight, hoping your esophagus behaved itself, and more likely to be listening to people talk and looking at pieces of paper. Which, let's be honest, sounds significantly less stressful, even if it introduced new ways for justice to be complicated. Mainstream historical fact: the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 issued a decree prohibiting clergy from participating in judicial ordeals, a crucial factor in their decline across Europe. A quirky or fringe tidbit: while other ordeals faded trial by battle, where the outcome of a physical fight determined guilt or innocence, persisted as a legal option in some regions, including England, for centuries after the abolition of ordeals like the hot iron or bread and cheese. Historians still argue whether the decline of judicial ordeals was primarily driven by the Church's opposition, the increasing power of secular states seeking more controllable legal systems, or the intellectual development of more evidence-based legal thought. So you've endured the hypothetical indignities, the whispered judgments, the frankly bizarre applications of pastry, drink, and flickering flame. You've imagined the pressure, the performative nature of these rituals, the way they etch themselves onto the lives of individuals, particularly women, shaping their destinies in ways that feel utterly alien from your comfy armchair tonight. But even the most deeply entrenched, seemingly immutable traditions eventually begin to fray at the edges, don't they? Like an old tapestry left in the sun, the vibrant threads start to fade, the weave loosens, and eventually, parts of the pattern just aren't visible anymore. That's exactly what started happening to these elaborate, physically focused tests of virginity. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic, overnight revolution where everyone woke up and said, "You know what? This bread thing is officially weird." History rarely works like that. Instead, it was a slow, grinding process, a gradual erosion of the belief system that propped these rituals up. Think of it like trying to stop a glacier. Immense, seemingly unstoppable, but constantly melting, shifting, yielding inch by painstaking inch to the relentless, quiet pressure of changing temperatures and terrain. One of the big forces chipping away at the edifice of these physical proofs was the simple, stubborn rise of reason. As scientific understanding, albeit rudimentary by today's standards, began to gain ground, people started looking at the world and the human body with a slightly different lens. The idea that a specific, observable physical condition, like an intact hymen, was the only infallible sign of virginity started to feel less convincing. They weren't performing dissections or microscopic analyses, obviously, but just general anatomical knowledge accumulated over centuries of practical experience by midwives, physicians, such as they were, and even butchers, started to challenge the simplistic assumptions. People knew bodies were complex, that injuries happened, that variations existed. It became harder and harder to insist that only sexual activity could explain a particular physical state. You might recall, maybe from school or just general knowledge, that the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment were periods where emphasis shifted towards empirical observation and rational thought. While these grand intellectual movements didn't immediately filter down into peasant villages and replace age-old customs overnight, they created an intellectual climate, a slow-burning wildfire of curiosity and questioning that eventually reached even the darkest corners of tradition. Scholars, theologians, and later legal minds began to scrutinize the basis for these tests. Was divine intervention really guaranteeing the outcome of eating a dry crust? Did a candle truly flicker based on someone's moral state? The more they thought about it, the less divine and the more open to manipulation or misinterpretation these tests appeared. Imagine being a learned doctor in a town where such tests were still performed. You've seen bodies, you understand basic anatomy. You see a young woman clearly injured, perhaps from a fall or hard labor, and the bread test fails her, branding her impure. You know, based on your experience that the physical evidence doesn't necessitate the conclusion drawn by the test. These dissonances, these quiet moments of doubt in the minds of people who were starting to think more critically, began to accumulate. They were like tiny cracks in the foundation of a massive building, individually insignificant, but over centuries, threatening the whole structure. Another significant factor was the changing landscape of social and legal structures. Feudalism, with its tight-knit, often insular communities and lordly authority, began to give way, very gradually, to more centralized states and more formalized legal systems. As courts and legal codes became more standardized, they started demanding different kinds of evidence. The testimony of a priest about a miraculous bread outcome felt less reliable to a trained lawyer than, say, multiple eyewitness accounts or written documentation. The focus began to shift from supernatural or quasi-supernatural proofs to more human, tangible evidence. Think about it. If you were accused of something today, you wouldn't expect a court to decide your fate based on whether you could digest a specific type of biscuit under controlled conditions, right? You'd expect DNA evidence, witness testimonies, security footage, paper trails. This shift towards a more evidence-based justice system, even in its early, rudimentary forms, made these traditional proofs look increasingly anachronistic and unreliable. They were too easily influenced by fear, anxiety, physical constitution, or even outright trickery. And trickery, you can bet, was a significant factor. People aren't stupid, even in times when formal education is rare. If your life, reputation, and future hinged on passing a test involving bread, wine, or a candle, you can bet people started whispering about ways to game the system. Maybe eat something beforehand to coat your stomach, practice holding your breath a certain way, find a sympathetic soul who could subtly nudge the candle. While these tests were rooted in belief and fear, human ingenuity or desperation finds a way. The more widely known these potential workarounds became, the more the inherent reliability of the test itself was undermined in the public consciousness. It's a bit like a magic trick. Impressive the first time, but once you know how the illusion is created, the magic is gone. The mystery surrounding why someone passed or failed began to dissipate as practical explanations, nervousness, illness, prior knowledge of the test's mechanics became more apparent. The church itself, which had often been the enforcer or legitimizer of these tests, also played a role in their decline, albeit perhaps unintentionally at times. As theological thought evolved, there was a growing emphasis on inward states, on faith and on intention, rather than solely on outward physical signs. While virginity remained a highly valued state within the church, the focus shifted somewhat from demanding physical proof to emphasizing the spiritual dimension and the individual's relationship with God. Confession, penance, and internal piety became more central to assessing one's moral standing, reducing the perceived need for a public, physical ordeal. Furthermore, over time, the economic and social pressures that made virginity such a crucial prerequisite for marriage began to shift in some regions, particularly in urban centers where social mobility and different forms of labor created new dynamics. While patriarchal control remained pervasive, the rigid reliance on physical proof for property transfer or social standing loosened in certain contexts. Marriage itself, while still a cornerstone of society, started to be influenced by factors beyond just lineage and physical purity tests, such as economic partnership or even, occasionally, affection. Gasp. One fascinating quirk during this period of decline is how resistant these practices were in certain localized areas compared to others. You might find a region where a form of the bread test persisted well into the 17th or even 18th century, while in a nearby city it had been dismissed as superstitious nonsense generations earlier. This highlights how change is rarely uniform. It ripples outward from centers of influence, encountering pockets of resistance along the way. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of this decline was the rise of scientific thought, the evolution of legal systems, changing religious emphasis, or simply the cumulative effect of skepticism and practical difficulties in administering and interpreting the tests. It's likely a complex interplay of all these factors, each contributing to the slow dismantling of a belief system that had held sway for centuries. Think of it like trying to identify the single raindrop that causes a flood. It's impossible. It's the combination of countless drops, the saturation of the ground, the overflowing riverbanks, the preceding drought that hardened the earth, a confluence of conditions. Similarly, the decline of these virginity tests wasn't caused by one thing, but by a changing climate of thought, law, religion, and everyday experience. You can imagine the conversations, the hushed whispers in taverns or marketplaces. Did you hear? Young Agnes failed the candle test, but Dr. Elias says she just has weak lungs. Old man Hemlock tried the bread on his new bride, but the judge said it's not admissible anymore, says it's a matter for the priest, not the court. These individual instances, these challenges to the established order, gradually eroded the credibility of the tests in the eyes of the community. The move away from these physical proofs didn't mean that societal obsession with female virginity vanished overnight, of course. Far from it. That particular fixation lingered, and in many parts of the world still lingers today, albeit expressed through different means. Societal pressure, reputation, economic dependence, even continued, though less formalized, methods of verification. The form of proof changed, but the underlying societal value placed on female virginity persisted stubbornly. Instead of bread and wine, the focus might shift to reputation, to community surveillance, to familial control, or even to later discredited medical examinations, which frankly often weren't much more scientifically sound than the bread test when it came to definitively proving sexual virginity versus just assessing anatomical state. The methods became perhaps less dramatic, less theatrical than the Candlelight ordeal, but the pressure remained. So as the curtain began to fall on the era of bread and wine judgments, it wasn't the end of the story of societal control over female bodies and sexuality. It was simply a transition to the next act, where new methods, new forms of pressure and proof, or attempted proof, would emerge to take their place. The old ways faded, not into oblivion entirely, but into the realm of historical curiosity, replaced by mechanisms that felt, to the people of the time, more rational, more reliable, even if from our modern perspective, they were still deeply flawed and rooted in patriarchal control. The grand stage of public ordeal began to dim, making way for more subtle, and in some ways perhaps more insidious, forms of judgment and control. So the elaborate, performative dance with bread, wine, and candlelight slowly faded from the central stage. The applause died down, the props were packed away, not in a sudden sweep, but piece by piece, like a theater company on a perpetually slow packing schedule. But here's the thing, and it's a crucial point. Just because the method of proof changed didn't mean the desire for proof evaporated. Oh no. That societal pressure, that intense, often male-driven need to verify and control female sexuality, simply morphed, finding new, perhaps less dramatic, but equally pervasive ways to exert its influence. The spotlight shifted, but the gaze remained fixed. Think of it like this. You stop relying on a faulty old compass to navigate, but you still need to know which way is north. The goal doesn't change, just the tool. And the tools that emerged to replace the physical ordeals were, in many ways, even more insidious because they were less tangible, less concrete, harder to point to and say, that ritual is unfair. Instead, they seeped into the very fabric of daily life, becoming part of the atmosphere you breathed. One of the primary successors to the bread test in its ilk was the quiet, relentless power of reputation. In communities where your family name, your standing, and the collective opinion of your neighbors held immense weight, which, let's be honest, was most places for a very long time, your perceived virtue became the new currency of proof. Were you seen as modest? Did you keep appropriate company? Were your actions beyond reproach, or at least beyond observable reproach? Your virginity wasn't something you proved in a single dramatic event. It was something that was constantly being assessed, calibrated, and judged by the watchful eyes of your community. Imagine living in a small village, maybe a few dozen houses clustered around a church or a market square. Everyone knows everyone else's business. The old woman knitting by the window sees who comes and goes. The baker hears the gossip while kneading dough. The priest knows who attends confession and, crucially, who doesn't. Your reputation wasn't just your own. It was tied to your family's honor, impacting marriage prospects for your siblings, your parents standing everything. A whispered rumor, a single questionable interaction could do more damage than failing the bread test ever could, because it wasn't a one-off event. It was a stain that spread, clinging to you and your kin like stubborn mud. This shift meant that the pressure wasn't confined to the moment of potential marriage anymore. It was constant. You were living under a perpetual, unspoken surveillance. Every decision, from how you dressed, to who you spoke with, to whether you were seen laughing too boisterously, could be interpreted as a sign of your moral character, and by extension, your sexual history or potential. It was a social web, spun from judgment and expectation, and it was incredibly difficult to escape its threads. It's a mainstream historical fact that in many historical societies, particularly pre-industrial ones, community reputation and familial honor were paramount. Individual privacy was often minimal, and social control was exerted less through formal laws, though those existed, and more through the powerful forces of gossip, shaming, and social ostracism. Losing your good name, especially for a woman, could effectively ruin your life, limiting your marriage options, your ability to earn a living, and your place within the community. This era saw parents and guardians become even more vigilant, acting as gatekeepers and reputation managers. Daughters were chaperoned, interactions with young men were strictly controlled, and public appearances were carefully curated. The goal wasn't just to be virtuous, but to appear irreproachably virtuous. It was exhausting, I imagine, like constantly being on your best behavior for an audience that never stops watching, not even when you're just trying to fetch water from the well. Simultaneously, another, seemingly more modern approach began to creep in: the use of early medical ideas and examinations. As anatomical knowledge slowly advanced beyond the most rudimentary understanding, thanks in part to pioneering, if sometimes ethically questionable dissections, certain physical features began to be identified and, crucially, misinterpreted as definitive signs of virginity. The most significant of these features, and one that unfortunately remains stubbornly linked to the concept even today, despite clear medical consensus to the contrary, was the hymen. So, Early physicians and lay practitioners observing this membrane began to believe that its state could serve as a reliable, physical indicator of whether a woman had engaged in sexual intercourse. An intact hymen was taken as proof of virginity. A torn or absent hymen was often seen as proof of the opposite. Now for a quick, slightly uncomfortable but necessary reality check that you probably already know. Medical science today is unequivocally clear that the state of the hymen is not a reliable indicator of virginity, defined as never having had sexual intercourse. The hymen varies significantly from person to person in its size, shape, and elasticity. It can be stretched or torn by non-sexual activities like exercise, horseback riding, using tampons, or even medical examinations. Some people are born with very little hymenal tissue to begin with, and, perhaps most obviously, sexual intercourse doesn't always result in tearing, and even if it does, it can heal. Relying on the hymen for proof is medically unsound, but back then this nuanced understanding didn't exist. The prevailing, though flawed medical theory became intertwined with the existing societal pressure. Instead of just eating bread, a woman might now face a physical examination. This was the quirky or fringe tidbit of this era, the development and propagation of early, often bizarre and completely inaccurate, medical tests or observations for virginity, many focusing on the hymen or other equally unreliable physical signs, like the appearance of the breasts or the state of the labia, based on equally baseless theories. These weren't standardized procedures. They varied wildly depending on the practitioner's limited knowledge and personal theories. These early medicalized proofs offered a veneer of scientific legitimacy to the old anxieties. They felt more modern, more rational than invoking divine judgment through bread. A doctor's opinion, however ill-informed by modern standards, carried weight that a flickering candle might no longer command. And so the burden of proof, which had shifted from a public ritual to constant social surveillance, now also landed on the physical body to be assessed by someone claiming medical authority. Historians still argue whether the rise of these medical examinations represented a genuine attempt at scientific verification, however misguided, or merely a new tool forged by a patriarchal society to maintain control over female bodies under the guise of science. It's likely a bit of both. There was a genuine, if nascent, interest in anatomy and physiology, but the application of this limited knowledge to the question of virginity was heavily influenced by existing social norms and prejudices. It wasn't objective science, it was science filtered through centuries of cultural baggage about female purity. Imagine the experience. You thought you were free from the bread test, but now you might face a physical examination, perhaps performed by a male physician with little understanding of female anatomy beyond what he could glean from textbooks, which were themselves often based on questionable assumptions and relied heavily on dissection of male bodies or infrequent access to female cadavers. The vulnerability, the potential for humiliation, remained high. It was a different kind of ordeal. Less public spectacle, more private intrusion. These examinations, like the reputation-based judgments, were prone to error, misinterpretation, and bias. A doctor's personal prejudices, their limited knowledge, or even the physical condition of the woman unrelated to sexual activity could lead to a false conclusion, and the consequences of a negative assessment remain severe. A ruined reputation, a canceled marriage, social disgrace. So as the medieval tests faded, they were replaced by this dual system: the omnipresent pressure of community reputation and the emerging pseudo-scientific authority of early medical verification. You were judged by what your neighbors whispered and what a doctor claimed to see or not see in your body. The spiritual or quasi-magical element diminished, replaced by social and biological, or supposedly biological, control mechanisms. This period also saw the formalization of some concepts that would linger for centuries. The focus on the hymen, for example, became deeply ingrained in medical texts and popular belief, persisting long after actual scientific understanding should have debunked its use as a virginity test. It's an unfortunate example of how a flawed idea, once introduced, can gain a life of its own, becoming common knowledge even when it's completely inaccurate. And of course, these new methods weren't foolproof either. Reputations could be manipulated. False rumors spread. Medical examinations could be inaccurate, or results could be faked or misinterpreted. Human behavior, with all its messiness, rarely conforms neatly to rigid systems of control. People still found ways to navigate, to conceal, to claim virtue or discredit others based on these new rules of the game. The transition wasn't clean. For a time, you might have found communities where elements of the old rituals lingered alongside the new reliance on reputation. A family might still informally use a version of the bread test while simultaneously relying heavily on neighbors' reports about a young woman's behavior. History, like the human body, is complex and messy, rarely presenting neat breaks or clear replacements. The rise of these new forms of proof reflected a broader societal shift towards different forms of authority. The authority of tradition and religious ordeal was gradually, very gradually, being supplanted by the authority of community consensus and increasingly the nascent authority of science and medicine. It wasn't necessarily a move towards greater freedom or less judgment, just a change in the mechanisms of control. The watchful eyes of the neighbors and the examining gaze of the physician replaced the anxious swallow of bread or the flickering candle. And while the more dramatic rituals faded, the underlying societal value placed on female virginity, a value deeply intertwined with concepts of property, inheritance, and patriarchal control, remained firmly in place. The methods of proving it evolved, becoming perhaps less theatrical, but no less impactful on the lives of the individuals subjected to them. It was a new chapter, not of liberation, but of adaptation, where the old anxieties found new expression in gossip and misguided medical theory. You were still on trial, just in a different court, with different but equally unreliable forms of evidence being presented. You've seen how these strange tests involving bread, wine, and flickering light were envisioned and presumably sometimes performed. You've glimpsed the mechanics, the fear they instilled, the potential for manipulation, and how the official support for such ordeals eventually waned, leaving echoes in superstition. But step back for a moment, think about the sheer acceptance of it all. Why did societies, smart in so many ways, building cathedrals, navigating oceans, developing complex legal codes, cling to these seemingly irrational methods? Why believe a piece of bread could choke a lie, or that a candle flame could reveal inner truth? This wasn't just a quirky footnote, it was embedded in the fabric of how people understood truth, justice, and the human body. The answer lies in a complex interplay of deep-seated beliefs, social structures, and psychological needs. At its core was a pervasive worldview where the spiritual and physical realms were not neatly separated as we often perceive them today. The divine wasn't a distant, abstract concept, it was an active participant in the world, capable of intervening directly and visibly. Sickness, misfortune, good fortune, these were often interpreted as signs of God's favor or displeasure, or the work of supernatural forces. In this context, the idea that God would provide a physical sign, a choking fit, a clean healing burn, the outcome of a battle, to declare truth in matters of justice or morality wasn't a leap of faith. It was a logical extension of their fundamental understanding of the cosmos. It was a world where miracles weren't just in ancient texts, but potentially unfolding right before your eyes. Imagine living in a world where you genuinely believe God might strike someone down if they told a big enough lie. It puts a different spin on those white lies you tell to get out of social events, doesn't it? Sorry, can't make it. My cat has, divine intervention? Yeah, that's it. Virginity, specifically female virginity before marriage, held immense social, economic, and religious significance across many cultures and time periods. It was linked to concepts of honor, lineage, and control over property. Ensuring a daughter's virginity protected the family's reputation and secured a favorable marriage alliance, which was often more of an economic or political transaction than a love story. For the husband, it guaranteed the legitimacy of his heirs, ensuring his property would pass to his biological children. The uncertainty surrounding virginity, it being an internal state not always externally obvious or definitively proven, made it a source of anxiety for families and communities deeply invested in its preservation and verification. It's a bit like trying to prove you didn't eat the last cookie when everyone is eyeing you suspiciously. Much harder to do than proving you did eat it. The tests we've discussed, whether the bread, the wine, or the candlelight observation, served a crucial social function beyond just attempting to ascertain a truth. They were rituals, public performances designed to manage anxiety, reinforce norms, and demonstrate adherence to societal values. Even if the truth revealed was questionable, the process itself was meaningful. It brought the issue into the open, subjected the individual to community scrutiny, and provided a seemingly objective or divinely sanctioned outcome that the community could then use to uphold its standards. These rituals created a shared reality, a public declaration of who was pure and who was not, based on the accepted rules of the time. They weren't just tests of virginity, they were tests by the community using available belief systems as their tools. Psychologically, fear played a massive role. The sheer terror of facing such a public, potentially humiliating, and consequences-laden test could induce physical reactions, choking, trembling, blushing, sweating, that were then interpreted as signs of guilt. The power of suggestion was immense. If you were told that only the guilty would choke on the bread, your anxiety about being accused, whether you were guilty or not, could easily make swallowing difficult. The mind-body connection is powerful, and in a high-stakes, fear-inducing situation, it could literally manifest symptoms that were then used as proof. It's the historical equivalent of someone telling you, don't think about elephants, and suddenly all you can think about are elephants, except the stakes were much, much higher. This highlights a quirky, perhaps fringe, aspect. Some argue that these tests worked less by divine intervention and more by expertly leveraging human psychology, essentially serving as early, brutal lie detectors based on induced stress responses. Was it divine power or just really effective psychological warfare masquerading as one? Mainstream historical fact. Throughout history, societies have created rituals and tests to regulate and control female sexuality, often placing the burden of proof and the consequences of perceived failure disproportionately on women. This is a recurring theme across different cultures and eras, not just limited to medieval Europe or the specific tests we've discussed. From foot binding to elaborate veiling requirements to modern-day purity balls, the control and policing of women's bodies and sexual behavior have been a persistent feature of patriarchal societies. The virginity tests fit squarely within this broader historical pattern. They were a means by which male-dominated structures sought to ensure female compliance with norms deemed necessary for the maintenance of social order, property rights, and patriarchal authority. Furthermore, the lack of robust, alternative methods for verifying private states contributed to the longevity of these tests. Forensic science as we know it didn't exist. Medical understanding of the hymen and female anatomy was often limited or intertwined with folklore. How else could one definitively prove something so personal and internal, which might have occurred in secret? In the absence of reliable evidence gathering, societies turned to what they did trust: divine judgment, public ritual, and perceived physiological signs. It was a solution born out of a lack of better options, combined with a strong motivation to control a specific aspect of human behavior. Imagine trying to prove you brushed your teeth this morning to someone who didn't trust your word and didn't have toothbrushes or cameras. You might end up having to breathe on a magic rock or something equally absurd by modern standards. Historians still argue whether the decline of these ordeals was primarily driven by changing religious views, like the church councils questioning divine intervention on demand, the rise of more centralized legal systems favoring witness testimony, or a gradual shift in worldview towards more rational or empirical thinking, even if rudimentary. It was likely a combination of factors, each eroding the foundations upon which ordeals like the bread and wine tests were built. As faith in the direct, observable intervention of God in daily legal matters waned, and as legal professionals developed more sophisticated, or at least different, methods of gathering evidence, the perceived legitimacy and practical utility of ordeals diminished. But the underlying need to categorize and judge female sexuality didn't vanish. Even as formal ordeals disappeared, the idea that virginity was something verifiable, something with physical signs, persisted in folklore, medical beliefs, often incorrect, and social expectations. Midwives continued to be tasked with examining brides, focusing on physical signs now deemed medical rather than purely divine. The fear of discovery and judgment, even without the formal ritual of the bread or wine, remained a powerful force. It's a bit like how you stop needing training wheels on a bike, but the memory of falling off keeps you careful. The formal test went away, but the ingrained societal anxiety about this topic lingered. The power of these beliefs also stemmed from their utility for those in power. For religious authorities, administering ordeals reinforced their role as intermediaries between the divine and the human world. For legal authorities or local elites, it provided a mechanism for resolving disputes and asserting control when conventional evidence was scarce. For families, it offered a pathway, however brutal, to uphold honor and secure alliances. These tests weren't just random strange customs, they served purposes within the social and political structures of the time. They were tools in the toolbox of social control, albeit tools that seem bizarre and cruel to us now. So the acceptance of these tests wasn't just about gullibility, it was woven into a tapestry of faith, social hierarchy, legal practice, and human psychology, all operating within a framework very different from our own. They represent a moment in history where the boundary between the sacred and the secular, the miraculous and the mundane, was far more permeable, and where anxieties about control and purity manifested in physical, performative, and often terrifying ways. It's a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained beliefs, especially those tied to social order and control, can shape even the most personal aspects of human life, turning something as simple as eating bread into a potential judgment day.